Hi, I'm Matt Staver. I'm standing in front of the United States Supreme Court in our nation's capital. It's an awe-inspiring building. It's even more awesome inside, where I've had the opportunity to argue before the High Court. This court decides issues that affect our life and liberty, freedom of speech, free exercise of religion. The issues that are decided by this court have spiritual, moral, and political consequences. Each generation has a duty to pass on liberty to the next generation. It's not transferred in our DNA. Pastors and church leaders and leaders of nonprofit organizations have the awesome opportunity and responsibility to speak truth to the culture in each generation. But oftentimes pastors and church leaders are confused with misinformation, and they're paralyzed because they think that speaking the truth that has political consequences will somehow jeopardize their tax-exempt status. In the next 30 minutes, we're going to talk about the issues and dispel the myths so that you can exchange the muzzle for a megaphone and speak truth to this generation. Join me on our journey as we go into the United States Supreme Court. I'm standing in the Supreme Courtroom, not in the nation's capital, but at Liberty University School of Law, where we have a replica of the exact bench in the Supreme Court of the United States. We created this Supreme Courtroom so that it represents the symbol of the rule of law. It also represents a symbol of the departure of the rule of law, and it's a challenge to our students that we're training for the next generation to restore the rule of law. As a former pastor and now a lawyer and dean of Liberty University School of Law, it's important that you as pastors and church leaders of nonprofit organizations know what the law is, know what your constitutional liberties are, and know the history of America. We want to talk about the issues of political activity of pastors and churches and nonprofit leaders and organizations around the country, because it's very important that you as leaders have the opportunity and are armed with the information where you can address the spiritual, moral, and political issues of our day. Before we talk about what the law is, I want to share with you a story because it's encouraging and it's also illustrative of the battles that you face as a church leader and nonprofit organization leader. It's about Megan Chapman. She was attending Russell Springs High School several years ago, and she was elected by the senior class to give the prayer at graduation. But the ACLU had other things in mind for Megan. They filed a lawsuit just a few days before the graduation, and a federal court said that neither Megan Chapman or Russell Springs High School could have prayer at the graduation. We contacted Megan just a few hours before graduation, and first of all we said, Megan, Liberty Counsel will represent you free of charge and get this order overturned. In fact, we eventually did. But moreover, if you just read the order, it says you can't pray. It doesn't say that you can't talk about important people or important events. So if you ultimately are led to talk about important people or important events, we'll stand behind you 100%. Megan went to the graduation that night. She had a secular poem prepared because of the court order. But when she stepped to the podium, she realized that God brought her there not to read a secular poem, but to give a message of truth. The packed auditorium of over 3,000 people were waiting to see what Megan was going to do. Just before she got up to speak, the entire senior class got up and said the Lord's Prayer in unison to the thunderous applause of those who were in attendance. Then Megan got up, and she had a choice to either read this secular poem or follow her convictions, and she realized God brought her there to speak a message to her classmates. So she shared her testimony in Jesus Christ. Thunderous applause constantly interrupting her with standing ovations. The next day in the Louisville Courier-Journal, on the front page, it said that a revival-like atmosphere broke out within the auditorium to the obvious dismay of the ACLU. That caught the news wires around the country, and that evening, Fox News found out about the story. I received a call the following day. They wanted to have Megan and I on Fox News, and so we were on Fox News that night, talking to millions of people around the country about her faith in Jesus Christ. I called Dr. Jerry Falwell at the time, and I said, Dr. Falwell, it's these kinds of champions for Christ that we need at Liberty University. What can we do for Megan? And he said, offer her a full scholarship to come to Liberty University. And so I did. When I offered this scholarship to Megan, she was overwhelmed because Liberty was her top choice. But she'd already enrolled at another school, thinking that she couldn't afford to come to Liberty. I thought, why didn't she just simply accept it? But she didn't say yes. A few days later, I called Megan again because we wanted to do a film of this important event. I got an individual on the phone. It sounded just like Megan, And I said, hello, Megan. She said, no, this is Mandy. I'm Megan's twin. I'm her twin sister. And I said, well, you must have been at graduation last Friday night. And she said, yes, I was the one who gave out the bookmarks with the Lord's Prayer to my classmates so that they could read the Lord's Prayer in case they forgot the words. I called Dr. Falwell and I said, Dr. Falwell, guess what? Megan has a twin. He said, give her a full scholarship to come to Liberty University as well. It didn't stop there. Megan had a choice, as I said. She could have had a silent graduation, but she chose to stand for truth and righteousness and for Jesus Christ. She not only was able to share her testimony to 3,000 people that night, but to several hundred people in the Louisville Courier-Journal newspaper, and then to several million people around the world on Fox News. But then CNN's God's Christian Warriors did a 2-hour special documentary, and Christiane Amanpour came to Liberty University where she interviewed me, as well as the twins, Megan and Mandy Chapman, and Dr. Jerry Falwell. That interview has gone around the globe many, many times, where she's had the opportunity to share her faith and her testimony in Jesus Christ. When Christiane Amanpour asked Megan what she wanted to do, she said she wanted to go to law school so she could fight against the ACLU. She could ultimately overturn Roe versus Wade, and she could defend religious liberty. Megan had a choice, and it's the same choice that you and I as pastors and leaders have every single day. She was confronted with an adverse situation. Megan was confronted with the ACLU. She could have simply caved into them, but she chose to stand. And as a result, instead of a silent graduation, God turned that which was intended for evil to ultimate good. As pastors and church leaders, you have the same choice. You can simply be silent in the face of overwhelming consequences that we see around the globe and in our communities, or you can stand for truth. Oftentimes, pastors and church leaders are silent because they assume by speaking out on political and moral issues, that'll somehow jeopardize their tax-exempt status. Nothing could be further from the truth. Before we talk about what pastors and churches can do with regards to political activity, let me first talk about the important difference between churches and every other nonprofit organization. Liberty Counsel is a nonprofit organization. It's not a church. It's a 501c3 tax-exempt organization. Individuals who contribute to Liberty Counsel have tax deductions, just like a church. They are nonprofit, and if you contribute to a church, the individual also has a tax deduction. But the fundamental difference between churches and every other nonprofit organization is that all nonprofit organizations have to apply to the IRS to get tax-exempt approval. You fill out the form, and then after 12 to 18 months or more, the IRS sends you a letter, and that letter will acknowledge that you're tax-exempt and contributions to you are tax-deductible. Churches are completely different. In the IRS code, they are exempted from that process. From the moment of conception, if you will, from the moment that they gather together to operate and act like a church is automatically tax-exempt without applying to the IRS. Churches can, but do not have to have a tax-exempt letter. Now, if Liberty Counsel were to lose its tax-exempt status, the IRS would take the letter away and we would have to apply again for the tax exemption and get the letter back from the IRS. In the meantime, we would lose our tax-exempt status if we were to violate some tax code. But churches don't have to have a letter to begin with, and consequently, if they lose a letter, it doesn't have a significant consequence. In fact, if you go back into the history of churches and nonprofit activity, not one single church has ever in the history of America ever lost its tax-exempt status for either endorsing or opposing a political candidate or endorsing or opposing legislation or lobbying. Not one in America. These restrictions with regards to nonprofit activity first came into the IRS code in 1934 with regards to lobbying. We'll talk about that in a few moments. And then in 1954 with regards to endorsing or opposing candidates. But let me talk to you about one particular church to illustrate my point. This church was in Binghamton, New York. And this church in 1992 decided to have a full-page ad in USA Today and the Washington Times, specifically opposing then-Governor Bill Clinton for president because of his position on abortion. The church listed its address and also asked for contributions to be sent to this church so that they could run more ads. Well, in November of 1992, Bill Clinton was elected President of the United States. After that, the IRS contacted this church wanting to resolve this issue because the church obviously endorsed or opposed a candidate for political office, which was in violation of the 1954 IRS Code. Instead of resolving the situation, the church decided to go to battle with the IRS. This church had voluntarily obtained its own tax-exempt letter, and the IRS took the letter away. The church then filed suit to get the letter back, and when it went up to the Court of Appeals, the Court of Appeals said that IRS's action was more symbolic than substantive because it did nothing to the tax-exempt status of this church. Not one single contribution was taxable. The church never to this day lost its tax-exempt status, even though its letter was revoked. This church is a clear example of going to the extreme in terms of endorsing, or in this case, opposing a candidate for political office. Yet even this church did not lose its tax-exempt status. Why? Because the very next day, once it crossed the line, if you will, as long as it didn't continue to endorse or oppose, that day is a brand new day, just like the moment of conception, like when this church was originally founded. If it were a nonprofit organization like Liberty Counsel or some other non-church, and you lost your letter, you would have to go through the process again to get it back. This issue of churches with regards to the letter is fundamentally important for you to understand, because if a church ever crosses the line and makes a mistake, all it has to do is to stop, and the very next day is a brand new day. The church never loses its tax-exempt status. With that in mind, I want to say, why is it that pastors and churches are so intimidated or terrified or concerned about losing their tax-exempt status, when in the history of America, it has never happened to this very day, not even with this church in New York. With that as a background, let's talk about political activity. First of all, let's focus on candidates, endorsing or opposing candidates for political office, and then secondly, lobbying for or against legislation. Let's talk about candidates. That restriction came in the IRS Code in 1954. In fact, it got there because of then Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson, later President Lyndon Baines Johnson. As he was running for the United States Senate, a nonprofit organization, not a church, opposed him for office. Once he became a senator, he proposed this addition to the IRS Code to limit nonprofit organizations' activity with regards to campaigns. Without any debate whatsoever, this was added to the IRS tax code, and it's been there ever since. But again, remember, not one church has ever lost its tax-exempt status for engaging in political activity where they endorse or oppose a candidate. Now, with regards to churches or any other nonprofit organization, the general rules are that the church cannot actually endorse or oppose a candidate. So you couldn't have ABC Church endorses or supports a certain candidate for president or opposes a certain candidate for president. That's clear in terms of what the regulations are. But again, if you made a mistake, as I mentioned earlier, not one church has ever lost its tax-exempt status when it went that far. So let's look at where the line is. Obviously, you cannot have a church corporately endorse or oppose a candidate for political office, but there's a lot of other things that are clearly permissible that don't even cross the line. Some of them are involving education. Churches can certainly educate about political and moral and biblical issues. These kinds of issues, whether abortion or marriage or feeding the poor or anything in your community, are never off limits for the pastor in the pulpit. The IRS can never come to the pulpit and tell that pastor what to preach and what not to preach. These issues of biblical importance that cover all aspects of our lives are certainly permissible in the pulpit. No matter whether the politicians are also talking about those issues, they're always permissible issues for the pulpit and the church. So you can educate about the important moral and political and social issues of the day. You can also, in terms of education, educate the people in the pews about the different candidates' positions on these issues, whether they are running as an incumbent or whether they're brand new and they're simply responding to a questionnaire. Take, for example, the issue of abortion. You can address the biblical issue of abortion. You can talk about Psalm 139, how God knew us in the womb. Jeremiah 1, how Jeremiah was known by God and even called by God when he was still in the womb. You can talk about the sanctity of human life. You can also either speak or give out information to people about the candidate's views on abortion. You can tell the individuals, whether from the pulpit or through printed material, where these individuals stand on partial birth abortion, parental consent or any other aspect of abortion. You can't tell them which way to vote, but you certainly can talk about the biblical issue, and then you can talk about the candidate's views on those important issues. Not only can you talk about the issue and the candidate's views on these issues, but you can also talk about the importance of being a voice to your community, how you have a prophetic witness, so to speak, to your community, not only by what you do in the church, but how you vote and who you choose as your elected officials. How it's important not only to be an ambassador for Christ in the community to spread the gospel, but also to be a clarion voice to the community on truth and righteousness. Whether or not you're in the ballot box, in the classroom, in your own home, or in the church or the community. Clearly you can talk about these issues and they are never off limits. In addition, you can actually have objective voter guides, and these are produced by many organizations. Liberty Counsel reviews many organizations' voter guides to make sure that they are in compliance with the IRS. You can always contact Liberty Counsel at the toll-free number or at the website lc.org for voter guides during any political election. We make sure these voter guides comply with IRS regulations. And the voter guides, as long as they cover a broad range of ideas, 5 or more, whether it might be abortion, the war, the economy, or taxes, or education, or more, they are permissible. And as long as they don't indicate which way the person is to vote, as long as they are simply objective in laying forth the individual views of the candidates, then they're permissible under the IRS rules. These voter guides can be distributed to people in the pews, in the community, so that they understand the different views of the candidates and they're educated on how to vote. So you can talk about the biblical issues, educate the people about how the candidates' views are on these issues, and then encourage them to vote. Churches can also assist the people in the community to get to the ballot box in a number of ways. First of all, you can register the people in your church to vote. Dr. Jerry Falwell did this all the time. He would have the individuals all stand up, and then those that were registered to vote, he would have them sit down. And those that were still standing, he would have the ushers come to them and give them a form so that they could begin to register to vote. Now, you can't tell them to register for Republican or Democrat or Independent, but you can clearly provide the opportunity for people in your church to be registered to vote. We can talk about all these important political and social issues. We can complain about what's happening in Washington, D.C. or even in local government, but if we're not registered to vote, we're not making a difference. People in the pews need to be registered to vote, and you can do that as a pastor. You can take a few moments out in the church service to encourage people to register and walk them through the process. Or you can have tables in the foyer spread out in various areas in the church where people can register individuals right on the spot. Not only can you register these individuals, but you can even bus them to the polls, particularly those individuals that have no transportation. The elderly or those that have no ability to get to the polls, you can facilitate that by taking them to the polls. Again, you can't tell them who to vote for, give them information and let them make their own decisions. In addition to talking about all of these important issues, pastors are individuals as well. Just because they're a pastor, they don't lose their constitutional right. While a church cannot contribute to a campaign, a pastor can contribute to a campaign. And while a church cannot endorse or oppose a candidate for office by putting out an ad, for example, in the newspaper, a pastor can endorse a candidate for office. A pastor can even use the title and affiliation, Pastor Matt Staver, and you could give the actual affiliation of the church. Put an asterisk by your name if you're going to put it in print, like in a brochure on the website or in a candidate's mailer, and you just simply say, a title and affiliation for identification purpose only. So you can actually have a quote from the pastor in a mailer that the candidate sends out, the title of the pastor, and the church's affiliation where the pastor is the preacher in that locale. Just as long as you have an asterisk there that simply says that the title and affiliation are only for identification purposes only, that is clearly permissible under the IRS rules. Pastors can get involved in work for campaigns, and they can endorse and propose ideas to candidates. Pastors are individuals just like you and I, and so therefore they're permissible to be able to get involved. Now, what about a pastor in a pulpit? that pastor is in the pulpit and says, we're not going to have the church tell you who to vote for. In fact, the church is not going to take a position as to which candidate is the best candidate to vote for. But as for me personally, just for me, I'm going to vote for this candidate because of these reasons. Now, the IRS actually says that when a pastor is in the pulpit, even though the pastor says that this is a personal view and not the church's view, that it in fact is attributable to the church. Frankly, I think that's unconstitutional. If a pastor, and frankly, if I'm in the pulpit, want to say something, whether it's on a candidate or whether it's on another aspect of the gospel, I'm not going to call the IRS to see if it's permissible. The IRS, as I said, has never revoked a tax-exempt status of a church. And if in fact it ever comes to that point where you have to preach your conviction or ultimately choose your tax-exempt status, at the end of the day, there's really no choice in that matter. We've got to obey God rather than Caesar. But again, pastors, I think, can give their personal view on political candidates, political issues, or any other matter that does not jeopardize their tax-exempt status. Pastors have a tremendous role in being able to educate people in their community. In fact, people in the pews are looking for guidance, and you are the clarion voice. Pastors have always been the fuel of the American Revolution and the engine of change in America and around the world. If you go back to the American Revolution, it was preceded by the great revivals of our time. The American Revolution was fueled by the pastors preaching biblical truth from the pulpit. If it weren't for the great revivals and for pastors preaching truth, we would never have had the American Revolution. We would never have had America, and we wouldn't enjoy the great freedoms that we enjoy today. I encourage you not to be silent by the ACLU or anyone else and by the myth of losing your tax-exempt status. You are watchmen on the wall. Now, for such a time as this, you're called to be able to speak the truth. You must do that, and you certainly can without any fear of losing your tax-exempt status. Now, other things that churches can do with regards to candidates involves the candidates themselves. The candidates can actually come to the church, and you can acknowledge them in your congregation by having them stand and acknowledge them and even indicate where they're running for office. You can even have a candidate come and preach in your pulpit. And the candidate can talk about biblical or moral or social issues, some of which are relevant to the campaign at issue, as long as the candidate does not use that time as a go vote for me, endorse me time or moment. Again, even though we have seen that happen many times in a number of churches, not one church, when that has happened, has ever lost its tax-exempt status. With this in mind, and with every election being important, and the fact that elections have consequences, not only in our nation's capital, but also in our local and state races as well, why are pastors silent? We've talked about political campaigns, opposing or supporting somebody for political office. But what about appointed positions? Like, for example, if the President of the United States nominates someone for the Supreme Court or any other cabinet or appointed position. Even though that person is being appointed or nominated, that's not a campaign. This person is not running for office, and people are not voting for this individual. So you can support or oppose that person all day long on behalf of the church as an official statement for the church. So the church can actually say that it supports or opposes this particular nominee for the United States Supreme Court. That's considered lobbying, not political campaigns. Speaking about lobbying, let's talk specifically about what churches can do. That restriction came into the IRS code in 1934, but from that time to the present, not one single church has ever lost either its tax-exempt status letter or its tax exemption. Lobbying is being in favor of or in opposition to any kind of law, whether it's at city council, the state, or the federal level. Churches can oppose or support legislation, so long as not more than a substantial part of their overall activity are dedicated toward lobbying. In other words, churches can actually lend their name in favor of or in opposition to specific laws, as long as not a substantial part of their activity is doing so. Now, what does that mean? There's no specific hard and fast rule, but we do know from IRS cases that 5% of your overall time is permissible, but 15% of your time is not. So let's look at the very minimum, 5%. 5% of a church that is really a do-nothing church can still mean that they can do a lot with regards to lobbying. Let's look at a church that on Sunday morning, they only have a few hours of service, 3 hours. They open at 9 o'clock and they close at 12 o'clock. They have no paid staff and no paid pastor. They have no volunteerism before 9 o'clock or even after 12 o'clock. In fact, the Sunday school teachers, when they begin their Sunday school at 9 o'clock, they've never done any preparation. You may know some Sunday school teachers that fit that model. But this is a do-nothing church. It opens at 9, it closes at 12, 3 hours. And then midweek, they have an hour and a half service. They begin at 7 and they end at 8:30. Again, no paid staff and no volunteerism outside of this total of 4.5 hours a week. This church only engages in 4.5 hours of total time in a week's time. Now, 5% of 4.5 hours is 13.5 minutes or so. This do-nothing church every single Sunday could spend 13.5 minutes of the service dedicated toward specific support or opposition to any kind of legislation. Now, what happens if this church one Sunday decides not to do anything with regards to lobbying? Well, in that case, the church the following Sunday can dedicate 13.5 times 2. What happens if it goes for, say, 3 weeks with no positions on lobbying? Well, then on the 4th Sunday, that church can dedicate 13.5 minutes times 4 and so forth. So can you get the picture? What about if a church for 6 months doesn't have anything to say about a particular piece of legislation or law? Well, you get the picture that this church can dedicate a lot of its time, in fact, several services toward lobbying and still be at the 5% level. And again, it's between 5%, which is permissible, and 15%, which is not. That's why churches can engage in so much activity that not one church has even come close to losing its tax-exempt status letter or its tax exemption. Now, to this do-nothing church, let's add a pastor who's paid 40 hours, and this church still only has 4.5 hours of operation a week. But now the pastor is paid for 40 hours and does other activity. Well, that's 44.5 hours. Let's add an assistant to this pastor who's also paid 20 hours a week, and then let's have some volunteers that actually do prepare for Sunday school, and they prepare, say, an hour every week before they get to church. You start to add up all of this time, paid and unpaid time, and all of that activity is the activity of a church. Now take 5% of that activity. You could literally churn a church into a political machine every single Sunday with regards to lobbying. Now, I know that that's not what you would do, but the fact of the matter is that's what you could do and still never jeopardize your tax-exempt status. Now, lobbying involves such things as being for or opposed to legislation, but it also includes constitutional amendments such as marriage amendments. Churches can specifically take out ads and have specific positions with regards to being in favor of a state constitutional amendment that supports marriage as the union of one man and one woman. Human life amendments or any other constitutional amendment fall in the area of lobbying. So whether it's a local or state or national law, or a state constitution, or the United States Constitution, or a local charter in your city or county, all of that falls within the rubric of lobbying, and all of that is permissible. So where does all of this leave us? What do you, as a church leader and nonprofit organization leader, do now? Certainly, you can choose to remain silent, but that's not what you've been called to do. Megan Chapman, as I mentioned at the beginning, had a choice. She could be silent in the face of intimidation and misinformation by the ACLU, or she could stand for truth and shout the truth from the housetops, and she chose to do the latter. God incredibly blessed this young girl. As a pastor, you are called to be watchmen on the wall, to be a person who is called to speak truth to this generation for such a time as this. The groups like the ACLU or Americans United for Separation of Church and State, they'll try to intimidate you and to silence you. As a pastor and also a lawyer and now dean of Liberty University School of Law, I want to encourage you to speak the truth. No longer can we use the excuse that you'll lose your tax-exempt status. We know that no church in the history of America has ever lost its tax-exempt status for opposing or supporting a candidate for political office. We know, for example, that churches and pastors can do a lot by speaking on biblical and moral issues. They can educate about the candidate's viewpoints. They can encourage people to vote, and they can assist them in getting to the polls. We also know that no church has ever lost its tax-exempt status for opposing or supporting legislation at the local, state, or national level, including constitutional amendments. So if that's the case, if no church has ever lost its tax exemption for engaging in lobbying or supporting or opposing candidates, then why are we intimidated? Why are we still remaining silent when so much is at stake? Now more than ever, Christians need to vote their values, and you as leaders need to be the engine that gives them the information and is at a fuel of a new revolution. In fact, if you go back to the American Revolution, it was preceded by the great revivals. It was the great preachers of our time that ultimately preceded and laid the groundwork for the American Revolution. If it weren't for pastors, the American Revolution would not have actually gotten off the ground. Pastors were the ones that spoke truth to the generation and that ultimately gave the biblical foundation for the American Revolution, that birthed the greatest nation, the most freedom-loving nation in the world, that sends missionaries all over the globe. If pastors had been silent, if they had been intimidated, if they weren't watchmen on the walls, we would not live in the great land of liberty that we now enjoy. Now we are at a critical time in America and also world history, and you are called for such a time as this. I encourage you to speak truth. It is important who we have in our elected offices, from the United States all the way down to the local level. It's important the kind of people that we have representing us in political office. If we believe in the sanctity of human life, then how can we put somebody in office who does not? If we believe in marriage as the union of one man and one woman, and that families, moms and dads, are important to children and for our communities, then why would we put somebody in office who does not believe that, in fact, who would actually undermine the very principles that we preach, that we believe that are biblical, and that we try to live out every single day? Just before we close, let me share with you some quotes from some of our founding fathers and great American leaders. The first is Reverend Charles Finney, a revivalist and also a college president. The time has come that Christians must vote for honest men and take consistent ground in politics, or the Lord will curse them. Christians have been exceedingly guilty in this matter, but the time has come when they must act differently. God will bless or curse this nation according to the course Christians take. John Jay, one of the first Chief Justices of the United States Supreme Court, he said, "Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty as well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers." And then Reverend James Garfield, who was also President of the United States and a minister of the gospel, he said these poignant words: "The people are responsible for the character of their Congress. If that body be ignorant, reckless, and corrupt, it is because the people tolerate ignorance, recklessness, and corruption. If it be intelligent, brave, and pure, it is because the people demand these high qualities. If the next centennial does not find us a great nation, it will be because those who represent the enterprise, the culture, and the morality of the nation do not aid in controlling the political forces." President Garfield spoke those powerful words in the late 1800s. It's the very time in which we are now living. He says that if our political institutions are corrupt and our morals are corrupt, it's because we are the ones to blame. We are the ones to blame when we remain silent. That's why it's so important that we speak biblical truth to our communities. It not only transforms our communities, but it transforms our political institutions as well. Now is a critical turning point in America and literally world history. And God has called you for such a time as this. I encourage you to contact us at Liberty Counsel. Our toll-free number is 1-800-671-1776. You can also visit us on the web at lc.org. That's lc.org. We have videos and information that you can give out to people in your communities. Other people who need to watch this video, you need to share it with them. Call us at the toll-free number on your screen or go to our website to ask for information. And Liberty Counsel is a national religious civil liberties organization. We have offices in Florida, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and hundreds of volunteer affiliate attorneys all over the United States. As Dean of Liberty University School of Law, we also have law school students that work on these important issues. All the activities that Liberty Counsel does, we do pro bono, free of charge. It's our mission to you. So don't be afraid to call us, because we'll never send you a bill. Don't be afraid to ask for information, and if you ultimately need representation, Liberty Counsel will provide it to you free of charge. One thing I want to encourage you to do is to not be silent. We have been silent for far too long. People are looking for a voice, and God has called you for such a time as this. Go to our website right now, lc.org, or call us toll-free, 1-800-671-1776. Make a difference in your community, in your state, in this nation, and around the globe, and may it begin with you today.